Welcome to the AA Podcast, our little corner of the web where we are not afraid to discuss tough questions like,
when did nutrition, health, movement, and stress management become alternative medicine?
Where we embrace challenges in all aspects of life to become healthier and stronger versions of ourselves.
And where food and movement are the best kinds of medicine, and cooking meals at home is a revolutionary act. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the AA Podcast. This is Ashley Olson.
And I'm Andrea Crane.
We are excited to have another episode brought to you this week. I don't know why I said that.
By us. It's brought to you by us.
We sponsor ourselves.
That's right. On the daily, we sponsor ourselves.
It's quite the feat, honestly. But we are going to dive deeper into thyroid health today. And if you have not already, I think this is a great opportunity to reference back one of our very first episodes, the autoimmune. There was a two or three part series on autoimmunity.
Yeah.
And it's still to this day one of our top listened episodes. So if you've not listened to that ever, or maybe it's been a minute, that could be a really good starting point after maybe listening to this. But we also want to preface that please listen to this episode in its entirety before we go into part 2 of this series. So this will be a 2-part series, and this episode is going to lay a lot of groundwork for what we discuss in episode 2 of this series. So
exactly.
We will reiterate that in the next episode. But yeah, make sure that you listen to this first. So, but before we get to all of that exciting details, we are going to share our weekly Bible verse. And mine is coming from 1 Corinthians 6:19 and 20. And it says, "Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body."
Oh, I love that. So mine is 2 Corinthians 6:2. For he says, "In the time of my favor I heard you, and in the day of salvation I helped you. I tell you, now is the time of God's favor. Now is the day of salvation."
Oh, so good.
No, we picked good this week. Pretty much every week. Yeah.
Proud of us, you know.
I know. Yes. All right.
All right. So, Andrea, how do you kind of want to lay the groundwork for these 2 episodes?
Yeah, that's a great question because thyroid, my goodness, we could do 8 episodes on this and still not be done. So what we're going to try to do, and I will just reiterate what Ashley said, it's so important that we have kind of this foundational knowledge and understanding before we get into treatment options and what you can do to kind of take control of your thyroid health. So the first thing that I guess I want to talk about is thyroid hormone itself, and just kind of the a little bit of the nitty gritty about the body's production of it. What are the types of thyroid hormone that we produce in our bodies, and then we'll go from there with some of the different signs and symptoms that something could be wrong. So yeah, we'll spend the bulk of our time in this episode talking about those things that can go wrong and what that feels like and looks like inside a body that's experiencing it. So that's where we'll spend the bulk of our time today. And so, yeah, the first thing I want to talk about is iodine. Iodine, oh my goodness, I have a lot to say about iodine, but I'm going to save some of it for later on when we talk about...
Can I
Yes,
pause you
please.
for 1 second?
Yes.
Can you just even give a brief description of what the thyroid does and why it's important?
Yes, absolutely. So the thyroid is a gland. It's sort of a butterfly or a bow tie shaped gland. It lives in your neck. And so when you go to primary care and they feel your neck, we're feeling for a couple of things. We're feeling for lymphatics, like those enlarged lymph glands, but we're also feeling for your thyroid. And so when a provider puts their hand menacingly on your throat and says swallow please, we're looking for that thyroid cartilage that goes up and down, to determine where your thyroid is, and further to see if we feel any lumps or nodules or anything of concern. So that's where your thyroid gland is. What it does in a nutshell is it responds to a gland that sits above it in the brain called the pituitary gland, which secretes hormone that tells the thyroid, hey, we need more thyroid hormone. Okay. And I will go into this in just a second. But then the thyroid responds to that by saying, okay, I'm going to up production of two types of thyroid. And guys, this is a bit of a misnomer. There are probably fractions of thyroid hormone that we have not even elucidated yet. So all of the products created by the thyroid, we probably don't even know all of what they are. But the two major fractions of hormone are T4 and T3. Okay.
Which isn't it
So,
crazy, like, just that
mm,
small little
oh yeah.
gland has so much power.
Oh my gosh, so much power. And we're going to talk about how much power it really has, because when things are awry, boy do you feel it. It's a huge problem. So the first thyroid hormone that we'll talk about is T4. So we're only going to talk about these two major fractions. T4, or it's also its longer name is tetraiodothyronine. So let's take that apart for a second. So tetra means four, right? Iodo refers to iodine. Okay, so here's where we're going to bring in that iodine piece. So tetraiodothyronine. So it is the 4-iodine thyroid hormone. All right, so T4 is created in the thyroid, and it has to have 4 atoms of iodine for each molecule of this that it creates. All right. So every time the body spits out a molecule of T4, it has used 4 iodines to build that thing. Now, T4 is inactive. In and of itself, it's inactive. It can't fit um, into any receptor sites that T3 can fit into. So why would we create an inactive thyroid? Well, I think this is just genius. I mean, God is clearly a genius in the way that we're designed. Kudos, God. But it's essentially a sustained release form of thyroid, because once you flick off one of those iodines, then T4 becomes T3, or triiodothyronine. Okay, that's the only difference between the two, is that atom of iodine gets flicked off, and now all of a sudden we've got T3, and this is the active form of thyroid hormone. So it acts on, oh my gosh, so many body systems you can't possibly imagine, from the brain and brain development. In fact, there is a form of iodine deficiency that is really profound in neonatal development. And if a child is born with no thyroid or low thyroid hormone, it can cause cretinism. These are permanent brain defects. So thyroid is really, really important, and we don't often think about it for brain functioning. But it is critical, and on into our adolescent and adulthoods and throughout our lives. It is really, really important. And so I'm sorry, you probably just heard me type. uh,
I
oh,
actually
okay.
didn't.
Are you serious? Oh,
Good job.
good. So I can cheat on this new platform. Sweet.
Oh,
Okay. So the brain, clearly, very, very important. But then metabolic activities, right? Like we all want to know about weight gain and weight loss with relationship to thyroid, but there's so many other things too. So let's see. GI systems are impacted. Fertility and menstruation is impacted. Like it's literally everything. Our temperature regulation is controlled by thyroid hormones. So this stuff goes everywhere and does so many things. So we've talked about T4, we talked about T3. All right. So now I want to talk about this little gremlin called reverse T3. Some of you have probably never had reverse T3 tested. Because you have not gone to a functional doc or a functionally minded doc or primary care provider. But I'll tell you what it is and why it's important. So there's this kind of evil twin. So T4 can become either T3 or reverse T3. Now, we don't really know why reverse T3 is created. There is a reason, so the body doesn't do anything just kind of willy-nilly for no reason, but we just haven't figured it out yet. So reverse T3 is an inactive form of T3. Okay, so reverse T3, it's important to know how much of your T3 is in that reverse form. Okay, because if the body is creating a lot of reverse T3, then you might have adequate T4, your TSH might be in range, but you don't have enough of the actual T3 activated hormone in your body to do everything that it needs to do. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so reverse T3 is important, evil twin of T3. Then we have this final thing I want to talk about, TSH. So
Okay.
TSH, that is the test, and I'll talk about it in a testing sense later on in this episode towards the end. But for right now, just know that TSH stands for thyroid stimulating hormone, okay? And people are probably familiar with this because this is really the only test that most conventional practices will run when they're looking at your thyroid function. All right, so thyroid stimulating hormone. Now, we talked earlier about the pituitary sitting above the thyroid, right? And the pituitary secretes, so it has ways of, and this is a very complex cascade of events that happens, but think about it this way, like the pituitary senses that the body needs more thyroid hormone, and this is an exquisitely regulated system, but it senses that we need more thyroid. Okay, so it says, all right, I need to knock on the thyroid's door and say, hey, we need more. You've got to amp up production. So it secretes the little chemical messenger that goes and knocks on the door is called TSH. So think about this. A lot of people get this just backwards. When TSH is high, thyroid is low, right?
Mm.
Because the pituitary is saying, hey, we need more, we need more. And so a lot of people, when they have high TSH, they think, oh, my thyroid is fine. I've got plenty of thyroid. My TSH is elevated, but it's just the opposite. TSH is not thyroid hormone, it's thyroid stimulating hormone. So that's what goes and knocks on the door and says, hey, we need more thyroid hormone. So when the body senses that it doesn't have enough, it's going to start creating more and more TSH to try
Hmm.
and get it. Okay. Now, if your TSH is too low, well, I say too low. We'll talk about TSH testing and some of the fallacies around this. But if the TSH is too low, typically the conventional medicine response to this is to take away your thyroid hormone. Like if they're
Mm.
supplementing with Synthroid or something like that, then they will say, "Oh, it's too high. Now we need to back off." Much to patients' chagrin. A lot of times they're like, wow, I was starting to feel okay, or I hadn't noticed any changes in symptoms, and now you're backing off my thyroid again. So the picture is much more complex than TSH alone, and we'll talk about that. So I want to put one final thought in your head with relation to T4 and T3. So knowing that TSH is what convention tests for, let's think about this. So let's say that you have adequate TSH and it's well within range, all right? But let's say that your body doesn't have what it needs to convert T4 into T3. So are you going to feel symptoms of hypothyroidism? Yes, you absolutely will, because you don't have the ability to convert the inactive T4 into the active T3. So there are so many complex mechanisms that affect thyroid, and so many, like if you think about this as a chain of events, there's so many spots within that chain that could be weak, right? It's not just TSH. And so that's why, in a functional sense, we like to know what all of these numbers are. And I'll go into the testing here a little bit later. But that's kind of the baseline level of knowledge. Any questions about that?
So, can can you kind of just simplify the T4, T3, how they communicate? Like,
Yes. So T4, I want you to think that's the one with the 4 iodine molecules, right? So I'm holding up 4 fingers with my hand. Now, in order to turn this is inactive. In order to turn this into a T3, we've got to have some chemical scissors or enzymes that come along. So the chemical scissor comes along and it cuts off one of those iodine, and it's now T3, and this is active. Now we have active thyroid hormone. But
okay,
if
okay.
you don't have those chemical enzymatic scissors, then you're hanging out with lots of T4, but it's not doing anything. And you
And that's
can't,
hypo.
yes, that is hypo. The hypo is low.
Okay.
Yes. So you will have symptoms of low thyroid even though your T4 levels might be fine. Your TSH might be fine.
Mm,
But if they don't check, what is your total of active T3, right? Or if you've got like gangbuster levels of reverse T3, if they don't know that, your labs look great and
okay.
you're fine. And they'll tell you, hey, all these symptoms that you're having, well, it's because you're old, or it's because you have kids, or it's because, I mean, pick your reason, right?
Hmm.
And all
And
of those.
then,
Hmm.
so go
Go
ahead,
ahead.
keep going. Well,
Well,
what's hyper?
so hyper, yes, we're going to talk about that. In fact, that's the next thing that we're diving into. Is what are the symptoms? So we've talked a little bit about hypothyroid, and we're going to jump into that later on in depth. But the first thing that I wanted to talk about is a little more rare situation, and that is called hyperthyroid. Okay. So what happens? So thyroid is a Goldilocks hormone. There's lots and lots of Goldilocks things in the body where too high is bad, too low is bad, and things like thyroid, too high can kill you. So it's a serious business. Although that super super high thyroid level is a rare event, and we'll talk about that actually in the next episode, where we
Mm,
talk about the actual pathology and diseases behind this and how we treat them. But for right now, symptoms of an elevated thyroid can include anxiousness and hyperactivity. Okay, it's that wired feeling where you can't calm down your mind. And so a lot of times with anxiety, patients that present with anxiety, there are a couple of things that I always test for. One of them is, which we're not going to get into today, we should do a podcast on this, but it's MTHFR,
oh,
which
yes.
is methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase. That is a very, very common genetic mutation. So I always check for that in my anxious patients. And then I also test for thyroid, because if they're having elevated thyroid, they can absolutely have anxiousness. And so, if I put them on an anti anxiety med, what am I doing for their thyroid? Absolutely nothing. And then it's wreaking havoc on all of the other systems in the body. So that anxiousness, that's a cry for help. That is, hey, something's going on here and we need to figure out what it is.
Hmm.
That's not to say that anxiousness does not exist outside of a physiological cause, because it absolutely does. There are absolutely psychiatric causes or neurological causes for anxiety, but it is my job and my responsibility to rule out any of the physical causes of anxiety, right?
Okay.
Um, so let's see. Diarrhea can also result from hyperthyroidism. So this is you have too much thyroid hormone. Also, unexplained weight loss can be, and I know that sounds great to some people, but trust me, not this way. In fact, there have been people that have, usually I've seen this in like the bodybuilding communities. I've seen this in the drastic weight loss communities where they will take supra or elevated levels of thyroid hormone. They will supplement with that to give themselves hyperthyroidism to lose weight. And
Mhm.
that is, boy, that is a terrible way to go about it because you will end up with a lot of stress on your heart, and that's not good. So, also, we can see things like tremors, like a fine trembling of the hands or the fingers. Um, a lot of times, this is diagnosed as an essential tremor, which means that we don't really know what causes it. It's just a tremor. And so, there are other medications that will be prescribed for an essential tremor without first checking the thyroid. So, anyway, it's good to get to the bottom of things. Increased hunger, because remember, thyroid bumps up your metabolism, right? That's why we see the weight loss. And that can result in an increased hunger. Sweating, so sweating, like just sitting, being heat intolerant and sweating. So I'm just hot all the time. I just seem to sweat all the time. That can be a sign of elevated thyroid. Also, menstrual irregularities. And I would like to tell you that, you know, X means that you're hyperthyroid and Y means that you're hypothyroid in terms of menstrual irregularities. But honestly, I have seen it all over the board. I will say that amenorrhea, or not having a period, is probably more closely associated with elevated thyroid, and having like massive bleeding and terrible cramps and that kind of stuff is more related to hypothyroid. Okay, but that's not the rule. That's not the
Mhm.
law. But menstrual irregularities, so difficulty sleeping, because again, think about this sort of amped up, hyperactive, anxious system. So difficulty sleeping makes sense. And also having clammy skin. All right. So with the sweating and the heat intolerance, you just got this sort of clammy, warm skin. Okay. Also having fine and brittle hair. So, hair loss is also a sign of low thyroid. So, these things are very tricky. This is why we have to test.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, fine brittle hair is another sign of hyperthyroidism. So any of those symptoms, and you really need to get this figured out. So that's kind of and that's not an exhaustive list, you guys, but that's a big list of the biggies that are associated with hyperthyroidism. So now we'll go into the symptoms of low thyroidism. And Ashley, I know you train a ton of people who have thyroid issues. I myself have thyroid issues. I only have half of a thyroid left. And yeah, tell me your experience with clients with thyroid, low thyroid.
Low thyroid, I mean, the fatigue, is definitely a big
Mhm.
one that
Mhm.
people have. Um, I guess, I see a lot of thin hair, brittle hair, so
Mhm.
actually, honestly, when you were talking about the elevated thyroid symptoms, it
Mhm.
just kind of spoke to me about some of my clients
Hmm.
that potentially could be
Yeah.
affected with
Yeah.
this.
That's
Um,
interesting.
yeah, so I I don't know. I think a lot of my clients are hypothyroid.
Mhm.
Sorry,
Yeah.
low
Yeah.
thyroid.
That's right.
Um, but, like, brain fog, people I
Mhm.
know, like, when certain clients get on their correct appropriate meds, like, the
Mhm.
brain fog, they're just like, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea." Like, I
Yeah.
just thought I was exhausted,
Yeah.
but just think and think or just think clearly now.
Right.
It's just
Right.
crazy. Obviously, resistance to weight loss, if you will,
Mhm.
that's kind of a catchy term right now in the
Right.
fitness world, but, just that resistance of, like, I just don't understand why I can't get this weight off,
Mhm.
and kind of there's a big trend in the fitness industry that if you and I think it's getting a little better, but the last several years, there's been this whole functional health movement, which is
Mhm.
amazing. Like, I love it.
Yeah.
But with that, there is this kind of sell, if you will,
Oh, yeah.
that if you don't get your hormones correct, then it's impossible for you to lose weight.
Mhm.
And it's not that black and white.
Agree.
So if you are not in a caloric deficit, whether your hormones are good or not, like
Mhm.
you're going to either maintain or gain weight, like
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah,
agreed, and the caloric deficit, honestly, that's what it comes down to, like, if you want to minimize and reduce weight loss to one sentence, it is be in a caloric deficit. Now, that's the black and white of it. However, it is incredibly nuanced because like there are so many things that goes into the calories in, calories out equation. It's
100%.
crazy. There are
Mhm.
50,000 things that go into that.
Yep.
And so it's not as simple as the calories in, calories out, and that's what frustrates me with primary care is that, patients will be told eat less, move more, and then they're sent
Mhm.
home. And there's so many other things like do we know what's wrong with this person? Maybe they need counseling,
Mhm.
right? Like maybe they are struggling with issues, from childhood that they need to work through, and they cannot lose weight, they cannot adjust their metabolism until that is fixed. So there's
Mhm.
there's 50 million things that we can do, um, but ultimately it comes down to the patient's willingness to do them. I mean,
Mhm.
that's the bottom line. We can suggest, and we can pull levers all day long, but it's got to be the client slash patient who's willing to take hold of that and do it.
Right. And we also probably need a whole episode
Oh
on
gosh, do we? Yeah.
calorie
Ha!
deficit
Yeah.
and weight loss because
Yeah.
yeah, it's not just I mean, everybody's baseline is not the same. And so
Right.
for us to just say, well, eat in a caloric deficit, it's guaranteed for you to lose weight. That means one thing for you and it
Mhm.
means another thing for me. So,
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
but like as far as I mean, I have a lot of clients that deal with anxiety,
Mhm.
but I don't
Mhm.
know if it's always a thyroid issue or lifestyle or even maybe, like you were saying, a neurological, psychological
Mhm.
thing too. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and anxiety is kind of like fatigue, right? There are these catch up, gosh, you know what? There are complaints that patients walk in with where we just like, "Oh boy, here we go." Like we need a history a mile long to figure out because
Mhm,
the differential list, and that is all of the things that could possibly cause the symptoms that your patient has. The differential list for fatigue, for brain fog, for anxiety, for, oh heck, for stomach pain, like it is a mile long of what that could be. And so, yeah, so a lot of these symptoms are nebulous, but that's where taking a really good history is important. And it takes longer than 2 minutes with a
mhm,
patient to figure all this stuff out. So, like on my list of symptoms of low thyroid, I've got fatigue, right? I have constipation on that list because, again, if you think about hyperthyroid, it's one of those kind of easy ones because if you think about what the symptoms of hyperthyroid are, turn those on their head. Like think about the opposite of those, and then you get the profile for low thyroid. All right. So this is by far the most common form of thyroid disorder is having low thyroid hormone. And so on that list, and we'll talk about the disease and the treatment of low thyroid in the next episode. But for right now, let's just understand the symptom profile because some of these will be news to you, I guarantee, to our listeners out there. So the first one, yeah, fatigue, constipation, brain fog. Gosh, I can't come up with words these days. It just seems like I'm forgetting names. All of this stuff. Hair loss. Again, could be hyper, could be hypo. It's more likely to be hypo. But again, we need to ask the questions. What about all this other stuff? Dry skin,
Mm.
slow metabolism or tough to lose weight. Now, I will say there are limits to what this can explain. This cannot explain a 100-pound weight gain. This cannot explain a 50-pound weight gain. This is not thyroid. Thyroid will explain, I don't know, 20 to 40 pounds. Anything beyond that, and you better be looking, and you better be looking at habits, and you better be looking at lifestyle issues, and you better be looking at casting a wide net for pathologies once those things have been exhausted. So I'll keep going. Cold intolerance, like people that get cold, I just cannot get warm. If you sleep cold, like I'm cold at night, I'm cold in bed at night. Um, a loss, now this is kind of a weird one, but a loss of the outer third of your eyebrows, that is related to hypothyroidism. And so I will often at a glance, check this in my patients that I suspect they may be dealing with some thyroid issues. And now it's a little harder to check these days because of microblading and because people draw their eyebrows in. But you can, if you actually look at the hair that is growing out of the eyebrows, a loss of that outer third can be related to hypothyroidism.
Super
Also,
interesting.
yeah, also a weird one is keratosis pilaris. So those are the little chicken skin kind of bumps that people get on the backs of their arms is one of the common places they show up. They can be on the thighs, on the outer hips, but these little bumps, this is keratinized skin that gets in those ducts and it sort of clogs it up, and so you get these bumps there. But what that is, so if I have somebody with keratosis pilaris, like I'll feel the outer edges of their arms, and oh, do you have those little bumps on the? Oh, yes, I've had those for years, and but. So then I will look at their palms, and I will look and see if there are any orangey. Ashley's looking at her palms now. That's amazing. Yeah, I'll see if there are any orangey discolorations, and then I'll also look at the nasolabial folds. So that's the folds coming down. I think we call those marionette lines. Is that what we call them, marionette lines? Anyway, I think they're nasolabial folds. Might be different marionette lines. Anyway, they're the lines that come down from the outer nair or the nostril, and they come down to your mouth. And so if there is an orangey sort of hue to that,
Yeah.
is that marionette
Okay.
lines? Oh, okay.
Hmm.
All right. So it just shows my lack of knowledge in the aesthetics world, but yeah, that's what those suckers are called. So if there's an orangey hue there, that further tells me that we might be dealing with some low thyroid. So that's an inability to convert keratin to vitamin A. And so the keratin just kind of gets I'm sorry, and by keratin I mean beta carotene, which is a precursor. So beta carotene conversion to vitamin A is what they're unable to do. Um, and let's see, so sluggish, just an overall sluggishness, dysmenorrhea. I talked about those really heavy periods, but also infertility. Is related to thyroid function, lack of an appetite. So, if they are putting on weight or weight loss resistant and they have a lack of an appetite, but Ashley also knows that lack of appetite could be your metabolism could be sluggish because you're not eating enough and because you're not moving enough. So there are other things that you can do to stoke those metabolic fires. But again, that's why the history is so important, right? Um,
Yeah.
So then there's anxiety. So wait a minute, we talked about anxiety being part of hyperthyroidism. Yes, it's also part of low thyroid too. So again, history. You cannot out examine or out treat a good history. A history is critical. Um, Also, sluggish deep tendon reflexes. This is something your provider can check for you, but I will check the Achilles reflex to see if that is intact, to see if it is sluggish. People with low thyroid typically have pretty sluggish Achilles or deep tendon reflexes. Um, Now, this is something that's not well known. Vestibulopathies like dizziness, like, I get something that might be mistaken for like a Meniere's disease. Like constantly dizzy, I constantly feel like the room is spinning. That can be related to low thyroid. So instead of putting someone on a medication that suppresses their central nervous system, you actually should be checking thyroid first. Next is an elevated cholesterol panel. So if someone has um, like a mildly elevated cholesterol panel, did you know this used to be diagnostic of a thyroid issue? Like if they had normal thyroid labs and then all of a sudden they were having over and over again this mildly elevated cholesterol panel, then that was diagnostic of a low thyroid. So we've lost that information. With the advent of the TSH test, we've lost all of this knowledge that we used to have about the kinds of things to look for thyroid, and we've reduced it. This is such reductionist thinking, but we've reduced the whole of thyroid function down to the TSH, which is ridiculous.
And then we just
uh,
throw them on statins.
yeah. Throw them on what? uh,
Statins, right? Oh, no,
no,
that's high.
thyroid
That's
hormone. Yeah,
no,
we put them
elevated
on.
cholesterol.
Yes, elevated cholesterol, we definitely put them on statins depending on their age and risk profile, but yes, they will go on statins. And then, which, oh my gosh, that's another show entirely. Then low ferritin. So, iron deficiency anemia. Here is another issue. So, a lot of times in conventional medicine, we'll just run a CBC, which a complete blood count. We'll see that your hemoglobin is fine, your hematocrit is fine, and we'll call it a day. However, also, your mean corpuscular volume is fine. That's another sign of anemia. The color of your red blood cells, I can also tell from a CBC. That's fine. So, no anemia, right? Well, maybe. So, I also will check a ferritin. So, a low ferritin, this is an iron storage molecule. If you are unable to store iron, it is a leading indicator of iron deficiency anemia, and you can feel really crummy with low ferritin. All right. So, low ferritin is also a downstream result of low thyroid, among other things. But low thyroid is certainly on the list. Now, the last thing I want to talk about that people may not know is hypochlorhydria can result from low thyroid. This is a diminished release and creation of stomach acid.
Hmm.
So, hypochlorhydria is related to bloating and digestive issues and all these other things that happen when we don't have enough stomach acid to thoroughly digest our food. So, that's why some of the treatment supplements that we'll talk about next time address this issue of hypochlorhydria while we're fixing the thyroid issue. Um, yeah, and that's kind of my TED talk on low thyroid. So,
That was very interesting. Like I Andrew and I talk about thyroid a lot.
mhm, mhm.
I talk a lot about a lot of things. So a lot of this wasn't news for me,
Mhm.
but the the ferritin and the hypochlor
Hypochlorhydria.
yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I didn't know about that. So,
Oh, good.
yeah, super interesting. So that i- is a rundown of the hypo and the
Mhm.
hyperthyroid. So what kind of tests should somebody go to their primary? Say like, "Hey, I'm feeling off."
Mhm.
Um and they're like, "Okay, we'll run a thyroid panel." What typically is ran at a conventional practice,
Okay.
and what questions should somebody be prepared to ask before even just running a typical
Okay.
panel?
Yeah, so if somebody is feeling like if these symptom lists are speaking to you, like you're like,
Mhm.
okay, I got this, I got this, I got this, please take that list to your primary care office and or send them an email in my chart or whatever kind of communication venue you have. They may want you to come in for a follow-up appointment. That's fine. Just do it. Do it. Take your list in and do it. Because well, here's the other thing. If you ask a bunch of questions by email, that office does not get paid for answering those questions. And so, in order to bill your insurance and get paid for that information, the ordering of the tests, the charting of all of that stuff, because you ask a question by email, and guess what? That all has to be charted. That all has to, there's so many things behind the scenes that have to happen. So please, please, please go in for the appointment. They're not just trying to extract resources from you. They're really not. They're just trying to get paid for their services. So make
Yeah.
the follow-up appointment. Talk to them
And
because
this is a
they'll
good plug for our, previous
yes, yes,
primary
please.
care episodes because that
Mm-hmm.
was so enlightening.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
just you'll know the ins and outs of how primary care works, and
Yeah.
why we do the things that we have to do. So
Mhm.
anyway, go back and listen to those episodes. The primary test that is run in conventional medicine, and to the exclusion of all the other tests usually, is the TSH. Okay, so we've talked about what that is. The TSH just tells whether or not the pituitary is asking for more thyroid. That's
Hmm.
it. That's it. That's all it tells. And so that's the only one that the conventional practice will order usually, okay?
Mhm.
Now, here's the thing. I'll talk about why they won't order it here in a second, but let's talk about these other tests. So the T3. The T3, again, like I mentioned before, T3 is the active form of thyroid, right? That's the one outdoing all of those things that we talked about in the symptom list. It's literally regulating every single piece of that symptom list that we talked about. So we need to know what that level is. I also order a reverse T3. I want to know how many gremlins I have in the system, like how many evil twins is the body producing. I also want to know what's your total level of T4,
Mhm.
right? What's your storage vessel like? Is your body creating enough T4 that can then be converted to T3? I look at the T3 to see if you're able to convert enough T4 to T3. What are those conversion mechanisms looking like? Are those healthy? But then, guys, here is the key. This is also the part of the test that you really have to fight for in conventional medicine, and I'll tell you why in a minute. You want antibodies run. If you have, now they may want to do this in separate pieces. They may want to run the thyroid panel first. Let's say you talk them into a thyroid panel and they say, okay, I'll run these values. They come back maybe a little wonky. Then you can push for the antibody test. If you go to a functional provider, I can almost guarantee you, I order these every year on my patients. So I want to know if you have antibodies. Okay,
Mhm.
we'll talk about the diseases that go along with having these antibodies in the next episode. But for right now, I want a thyroid peroxidase antibody test and I want a thyroglobulin antibody test. So I want to know is your body attacking your thyroid? Because that is the most common cause of low thyroid in America. Okay, now hear that. That is the most common cause. So if you have low thyroid, there's about 95% of these cases are caused by autoimmunity.
Mhm.
So let that
95?
sink in. Yes, I have seen values up to 95%. I've seen 70%, but more and more often I am seeing in the 90s. So think
So
about
that's a
that.
good distinction. Is thyroid, so hyper, hypo,
Mhm.
is that in and of itself a autoimmune, or is it a result of a autoimmune?
It is a result of an autoimmune process.
Okay.
And if we're believing the 95% number, which I absolutely do, that
Mhm.
means that only 1 out of 20 hypothyroid people are going to have something else wrong with them causing the low thyroid. 19 of those 20 people are gonna have an autoimmune disease. That's what that number
That's
means.
a high percentage.
Yeah, it's huge. So, yes, can we rule out, like, if your antibodies are perfect and you have wonky thyroid, you might be the 1 in 20 or the 1 in 10 that it's
Mhm.
related to something secondary, and that absolutely can happen. But I just want people to know how truly common this autoimmune thyroid issue is. So now, finally, let's land this with why won't my conventional provider order these tests? Why won't they just do it? I walk in there, I beg and I plead, and all they have to do is put pen to paper. That's literally all they have to do. Click a box, and the test gets ordered. Why won't they do that for me? Okay, the first reason they won't do it for you is because uh, once you order a test, you own the test. You own the results of the test. It is incumbent upon you professionally to do something about that test, whatever it comes back.
Which
So,
in my mind, when you say that, sounds
mhm,
like, well, my doctor doesn't actually want me to feel good.
I can understand that. I can understand that. But here's the other thing. There are very complex tests that would be let's think about it this way. There are very complex panels that are only ordered by, say, hematology for blood cancer. I'm not ordering those tests because you know why? If I run them, I own those results as a provider and I have to do something about it. And it would be a disservice to my patient because I don't know what to do about it. I'm not a hematologist. I'm not trained in blood cancers. And so, essentially, if I'm not going to do anything about the results of that test because either I don't believe in treatment for it, as I'm going to talk about in a second, or because I don't know what to do. I don't know how to treat somebody with leukemia. That is not in my wheelhouse. And so, therefore, I'm not ordering that test, but I will give you a referral to hematology.
Mm,
Does that make sense?
yeah.
So that's why. Now, here in a conventional sense, why won't they order these antibody tests for me? The reason is because conventional medicine will not do anything to treat antibodies. They just say, well, there's nothing you can do. You can't change your diet. You can't, like, there's literally nothing you can do about autoimmunity except take drugs to suppress the immune system. All right. Now, with thyroid, it is a specific form of autoimmunity where we just treat it with thyroid hormone and that puts your TSH back in range. So that's all I'm going to do. So if your TSH is wonky and I can treat it with this drug and that puts it back to normal, then why on earth would I run all of these other tests that I'm not going to do anything about? If you come back with a crazy T3, well, your TSH may be off, and so I'm just going to treat the TSH anyway. So why would I run a T3 if it should be showing up on the TSH? But what I'm saying and what functional practitioners are saying is that patients are still feeling crappy. They feel
Mhm,
crappy. Their
mhm.
TSH may be beautiful. It may be exactly where you want it. It's right in lab range, but there are so many other areas that could be going wrong between the TSH and an active T3. And we need to dig into what those are.
Yep.
Um,
We have to have a full picture.
that's right. That's right. So again, that's why they won't run antibodies because whether you have antibodies or whether you don't, out of those 20 people tested, the one or two that have secondary hypothyroidism to, you know, something else, we treat them the same.
Mhm.
The 19 or 18 that have autoimmune thyroiditis, we treat them the same. We give you thyroid. That's it. We give you levothyroxine, synthetic T4 hormone. That's what we give you.
Mhm.
And that puts your TSH back in range, and then we close the books on you.
So, if you go to your doctor and you
Mhm.
say, "Hey, these are my symptoms.
Mhm.
This is what I would like. I would like a full comprehensive thyroid panel." And they're
Mhm.
like, "Well, let's just start with the TSH and let's
Mhm.
just see if that
Yep.
what those levels look like."
That's exactly what they'll do most of the time. Yeah.
Okay, so do you say, "Okay, let's do it. I'll entertain you," but
Yeah. Yeah, you
okay,
probably do. You probably
okay.
do. Because you gotta understand that, yes, patients come in wanting things, but also you went to school for a really long time, right? Like there's that piece of it. And so you want to provide really good care, but then you're also taught that it's your responsibility to make sure that the system that you're using resources wisely, and that includes insurance dollars too, right? So if I'm ordering $6,000 worth of tests on every single patient, then the insurance premiums go up, and then nobody can afford insurance. So like there are so many pressures on providers. Um, it's just crazy, and I know people want what they want because they don't feel good, and
Mhm.
I get that with every fiber of my being, and I'm so lucky to be able to order the tests that I want in my
Mhm.
practice. But these are some of the realities. So a provider looks at this, and if they don't believe or they don't know, then they're just like, this patient wants $6,000 worth of tests. And then I have to go back and explain every single one of these to this person. Meanwhile, I'm barely scraping by seeing 20 patients a day.
Mhm.
And it's unsustainable. So there are two sides to this. And believe me, I totally understand the patient side. Literally, the reason why I became a provider is because I had no providers to recommend to my patients,
Yeah.
which is crazy. And I can't describe to you how difficult it was to go back and get all of this done. But in the end, it is so that I can provide the kind of primary care that I couldn't find as a patient myself or recommend for my nutrition clients.
Amazing.
So there's a lot of considerations that go into this, and I'm not going to throw providers under the bus because I know they're dying in practice out there, and they're
Mhm.
trying to do the very best that they can.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure, some of them have crappy, burnt out attitudes, and I understand that, and those are the ones you vote with your feet and you go somewhere else.
Yep.
Um, but it's
Again, go back to our episodes
yes,
on
please, please, please.
the primary on primary care because it is so
Hmm.
eye-opening. I know, as somebody that didn't know this prior to when Andrea was going through school and then working in this actual office, I was mind blown. I was just like, this is not common knowledge.
Yeah.
And so that those 2 episodes were very enlightening, on we think, "Oh, they're a doctor, they're making bank." No, go back to those episodes. Like, they're
Go back to the episodes.
yeah,
Yeah.
go back to those episodes. They're n they're n
Yeah.
they're not making as much as you think that they're making,
Yep.
and they're doing so much legwork behind the scenes. So, anyway, with that being said, so you would entertain the TSH
Mhm.
test,
Yep,
okay?
entertain the TSH. The TSH comes back fine, and they say, "I'm
Okay,
not running any more tests." So you know what you do? You make a follow-up appointment, and you say, "Listen, I still have these complaints. What are we
okay,
gonna do?"
okay.
And if they don't if they just blow you off, if they tell you that, "Well, you're old, you're 50, this is in your head, you just need to get up and do more,
Move
you just
more,
need to"
eat
yes,
less,
move more, eat less. Yes, if they tell you, "Well, you've got young kids, this is how you're supposed to feel." No,
work on your
uh-uh.
sleep hygiene. Yep,
Exactly. Nope, you go somewhere else. You go somewhere
okay,
else.
alright,
Yeah. Give them a chance. Give them a chance to do the right thing, to dig a little. But if they're not going to do that, then you go somewhere else.
alright. That was another thing in the primer on primary care episode was just like as a patient, you have
Mhm.
so much power
Yeah,
in a lot of things, and you should never feel put down or ashamed for asking more questions or for
absolutely.
prodding
Yes.
for more answers.
Yeah,
You know your body better than anybody else.
that's right.
Yes, they have the book smarts and they have the knowledge, but they are not living in your body.
Yes, that needs to be in service of you and not in contradiction to you.
Exactly. So,
Yeah.
all right, Andrea, I think that is a wrap on this first part of this episode for thyroid, right?
Yeah, that'll do
All
it.
right. So again, please, 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 don't listen to the second part. I mean, if you've gotten this part, you've already listened to this part. But
Chances are. Yeah.
yeah. So we will have episode 2 coming up next week. But I hope
Mhm.
this was enlightening for you guys, and just like Andrea mentioned earlier, like if any of these symptoms are speaking to you, please get in with your PCP and
Mhm.
just start digging for some answers,
Yeah,
and don't settle for your TSH or your typical blood panel for thyroid is looks good if you still have all these symptoms. Like even
exactly.
if it may not be your thyroid, it's something else. You know
Yeah,
you don't feel well. So
yeah.
please dig for answers.
Mhm.
And if you have any questions, or if you are like, hey, would you talk about this too? Please always hit us up, whether it's on our email, ask a podcast@gmail.com, or shoot us a message on Instas. We most
Mhm.
likely won't answer your question in detail on Instagram, but we see the questions and then we will try to put it in a form that is available for the broad audience. So,
Yeah, we'll
um,
put them in the show, so let us know your questions.
absolutely. So, we love hearing from you guys, but we will wrap this up and we will see you in the next episode.
Bye-bye. The content provided in the Double A podcast is intended for informational and educational purposes only. The podcast is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. The information and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute medical advice.